Before I start my presentation, I just want you to take it from the perspective of a practitioner in the Philippines who's been in practice for the past 15 years, seeing more than 5,000 patients. And so it's from that perspective. And the difficulty of my presentation was really on reflecting what it is that if I had £1, I'm going to ask politicians to spend on, So it's a really big £1. And I will pretend that you are the politicians. Okay. When Teresa said earlier that, parenting for the nation, it really sent off it echoed to me because I already will tell you my conclusion in the beginning of my presentation. That really when we talk about preventing child maltreatment, it's really about nation building in the end. And you will see what I mean later. Okay. So I had to pick, which of my recommendations would give the biggest bang for that £1. And I think it's the adolescence. Well, never mind what Heckman said, to heck with it. But really, adolescence is a critical period in reducing abuse and exploitation in low and middle income countries. This is just a very short summary. Teresa has already said this, but since you're politicians, when I do a lot of lobbying, and when I show the brain, it gets the interest of politicians because they don't use theirs. So they're always interested how other people use their brains. So this is the brain, and there's been a lot of studies about the brain. And so we did the adverse childhood experiences study in the Philippines, and we did see the effects of adverse childhood experiences in childhood and how, when it happens during the critical and sensitive developmental period, and you put into the pool genetics and the effects, triggering the environment, triggering epigenetics, you'll have changes in the brain, especially both in the architecture and in the wiring of the brain, adapting to this toxic stress and leading to all of these effects that has already been nicely discussed by Teresa earlier. So the question there is, when is this critical period happening? And of course, a lot of people would say that the first 3 years of life would be a critical period when the brain is still developing mightily and it's very sensitive to the environment. But science has also shown that really critical periods go on and staggered throughout development, especially the more complex parts of it, and that it tends to reflect more cumulative sensitive periods rather than one single critical period. That's why, when we talk about risk, it's not about what risk, but it's more about the number of risks, because it's cumulative risks that lead to all of this really long-term damage that we see later on. So the adolescent period is really quite vulnerable in that effect because aside from all of these cumulative risks, the child by herself being in this period also has all of those hormones coming in. And so you see this increase in risk-taking in normal children, not necessarily abused ones. The sensation-seeking, rewards having more salience than punishment, mental health problems. In fact, most of the mental health problems would be diagnosed by the age of 14 years. Age of first sexual victimization, usually also as the UNICEF study has nicely summarized, a lot of it, majority is happening during the adolescent period. And when we talk about commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking, the increasing numbers of trafficked persons are children, especially adolescents, girls, and that's increasing now. They're second in category to adult women when we talk about, traffic victims. And so when we talk about adolescence, what we'd like to do is to preserve the gains of the early periods, But whatever we do in adolescence, be it primary intervention, secondary, or tertiary intervention, they really result in primary prevention for adulthood, for the effects in adulthood, and for the next generation. Especially when you're talking about teenage pregnancy and the like, then whatever you do in terms of intervention in this period will affect, the children of these adolescents. So that's why when we talk about these different outcomes, and I would just divide them into 5: physical, education, social, psychological, emotional, and material, we find that when really almost all the different sectors, they talk about the same thing. And when you talk about health, when you talk about education, social welfare, criminal justice, we are all working towards the same outcomes when it comes to children. But these different outcomes are so interrelated and interdependent. It's really very quite complex. And outcomes of one dimension influences outcomes in other dimensions, and the drivers of one are often the drivers of another. So they're really all interconnected. And more so, for example, the most important determinants of health are found in sectors other than health. And one can say the same thing for education, social welfare, justice, and so forth. Okay. So, how about outcomes of child protection? We also recognize that the outcomes of child protection are recognized as outcomes of health, education, social welfare, justice. We're all working towards the same outcomes. But when we try to locate, when I talk to politicians about child protection, it's very difficult for them to figure out what is child protection, because they think about health, they think about education. And what we're talking about in terms of preventing, we're talking about things that did not happen. So they get confused. So what is it? And when we talk about, so what are these risk factors that we want to, and protective factors that we want to prevent or to promote, it's all the same for these different sectors. I'm not going to go through each of this because I'm sure you're quite familiar with them. But when looking at the socio-biological framework of Bronfenner, you would see that all the other sectors are working with the same risk and protective factors. Okay. It's not going to the next. Okay, you say, oh no, she's going to do Maslow. No, I'm not going to do Maslow. What I just want to show with this slide is that developing countries are really most of the time working in terms of just availability of services, and when you're talking about the Maslow hierarchy of needs. But you could see that this is not really a hierarchy, these different overlapping pyramids, because they really can rearrange themselves anytime. Whereas developed countries are more or less working towards self-actualization. There's really that big gap when we talk about goals, of developing and developed countries. But you really need these macro-level factors, because participation of citizens in a country, they have first to have some threshold of livelihood, of living, before they can even participate in the governance of that country, and before you can even talk about self-actualization. And governments like to invest really in macro-level factors, So because structural reform is just really so attractive, such as reducing unemployment, improve schooling, housing, working to reduce stigma and discrimination, that gets a lot of votes. Okay? And all of this really are outcomes of all the different sectors that I was talking about previously. Child protection, health, education, social welfare, all of this are working towards this. So, when we look at the teens, there are a lot of them. There's 1.2 billion people aged 10 to 19 years in the world. And the majority of them live in low and middle income countries. Now, if we reduce violence in this population, they constitute really in the developing world more than half of the population. So Alex, that's 50% reduction. Okay, and that's just simple arithmetic. Okay. So when we talk about the youth, all countries, whether it is developing or developed, talk about the disconnected youth, that something needs to be done. And in developing countries, when you talk about victims of trafficking, commercial exploitation, or children who are in conflict with the law, then, you certainly get the attention of everyone, that something needs to be done. And what are those things that need to be done with this youth to prevent all of these bad outcomes, really? So there goes my recommendation 1 for that pound. What will give the biggest bang for that 1 pound? Recommendation 1 is universal access to secondary school. I mean, already when we talk about MDGs, 84% of children at least have already passed through primary school, but only half have completed secondary school. And so much research has shown what completion of high school can achieve. It's the best, actually, according to the review for the Center of Global Development, in the review of reviews of reviews, it seems that graduating from high school is better than contraceptives in decreasing teenage pregnancy. When you talk about early marriage, it seems again that graduating from high school is really a good way of decreasing early marriage, what research in Bangladesh has shown. Okay, when we talk about decreasing child mortality, even, they saw in their review of, in the last more than a decade of the under 5 mortality, that half of that is due to maternal education. And 10 years or more of maternal education will decrease your child mortality. So secondary education is not enough. So there must be effort so that they complete it. It's different about, when you talk about access. For example, again, one study for the Center of Global Development showed that even just giving free uniforms, increased the graduation from high school. In our own work in the child protection units, we saw that those whom we supported to finish high school, there was no re-abuse. There was none. And then they did better also mentally and psychologically. So, but then the high schools have to be of good quality, and they should also be linked to jobs, because what's really the point of graduating from high school if you really do not find work afterwards? Okay, so those are the things that also has to go with this completion of secondary school. Then we look at the burden of mental health problems, and we see from this work of Killing, Baker, and Henningham that a lot of adolescents really are affected by mental health problems in the developing country. And really, in the Philippines, for example, we really have difficulty getting, psychosocial interventions. When Yolanda came, the strongest typhoon to ever hit land, the basic services, although it was difficult, but still, there was resources for that, but not for psychosocial intervention. It was difficult to find them. They don't exist. So, and when we look at, all of the risk factors for mental health problems, you could see, that it's also child protection. All of these lifelong risks, when you look at it through the life course from preconception, prenatal, infancy or early childhood, school age, adolescence, and going to the next generation, all of those risk factors are also child protection risk factors. It's everybody's risk factors. And this is mental health risk factors. Okay, so my second recommendation is universal access to mental health. And that means, of course, both prevention and intervention For example, emotional development could be incorporated into the curriculum from ECCD to elementary and to high school. And it means, the way that the community health workers, the primary care physicians, etc., that the way that they give service to incorporate mental health into those existing service. And when we talk about mental health, it's not just about anxiety, suicide, depression, but it also includes developmental problems such as ADHD and so forth. It may need task shifting in developing countries because we do not have the people to deliver it. Of course, task shifting is just transitory. It's not the solution. But until we have the personnel to deliver it, then we really need to do task shifting. Right now, one of the research that we're doing is how to deliver trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy in the communities using social workers. But I do know there have been work for lay people to deliver it, not even social workers. And it has been shown to be effective. Okay, recommendation 3, of course, because now we see all of these sectors having the same, working for the same common outcomes, would be reorganization of services for better integration and collaboration. So how do we do that? Well, we know that when we talk about governance in the 21st century, and this is a WHO publication, the way that governance now has been really evolving is that it's less hierarchical, it's more collaborative, it's engaging citizens, it's more about persuasion, a little less regulation, and we're talking about independent agencies and expert bodies, really going into policy making. Okay, so this is a slide showing one of the committees that we have in the Philippines where I sit, and this is the Committee for the Special Protection of Children. And as you could see here, all the different departments in the Philippines that have anything to do with child protection or working for outcomes of child protection are all a member of. And my suggestion actually to make this committee more effective is that we will have focal action people on child protection who will belong to these different departments, but who sits in this committee really having that linking, and working together, and that's their job. It's not going to be an add-on responsibility. And I would add on to this committee ECCD, academe and expert bodies, and business. So that will be future work that I would like to do in the Philippines. But this is just an example of integration and collaboration. Okay, so recommendation 4 then would be collaborations to increase capacity in prevention and implementation research. I mean, we really need that in the country. And so that may need partnerships with North and South, South to South partnerships, because if we want to do really good prevention work and implementation of what is already out there, we do need to develop that capacity, which is not existing right now in my country. And so we need to talk about cultural adaptation, so workforce capacity, for example. Like, there's a lot of laws, programs, and policy, but when you are in the ground, in the front line, there's just one person doing this work. And that's one lonely social worker, implementing all of these programs, and it's just not possible. And we also have to look at the service systems that should be appropriately structured so that that program would run well. When you talk about home visiting programs, for example, what if you identify a child who is delayed or a child who is abused and there are no services for them? What do? Parents need jobs, they need livelihood. If that does not exist, will your home visiting program be successful? Well, another example is when I came home from my training from the United States and we were talking about rape kits and all that. It was so easy to come up with the rape kits. It cost less than £5. but we couldn't do anything. Why? There was no DNA technology to do those rape kits. The DNA had first to be, the capacity to do DNA had first to be developed. And then, they had to do a population-based study for that DNA to be assessed. And then the police needed the capacity to store, and keep the evidence and all that. So so my other example, and which the chair of my board really hates so much, but I like it anyway, is that when you're in a developed country, you go to the grocery, you buy rice, it's there, and it's easy. You expect it to be there. When you're in a developing country, the rice might not be there. Because what do you need to do first? Maybe you need first to have land reform. You need to build market, farm-to-market roads for the rice to get into the grocery. So that's what I mean about, you must have the structures in place for a lot of these programs that are developed in developed countries to function in a developing country. So we need to identify what are really the key ingredients or core components, because when we now adapt it, I think the question has always been fidelity versus cultural adaptation. So we have to be clear on what are the core components that cannot be changed, before the cultural adaptation can take place. That's why I also became very much interested in these kernels of evidence that was, that's being promoted by Embry and Binglan, because these are like things that you can do immediately. It doesn't need a program, but these units of behavior that can cause behavior change, that's really common in a lot of programs, like say, for example, in parenting, timeout, that bonding with the child, how do you praise children, etc. That can immediately be taught even without a program, and you could teach a lot of people in the front lines on it, and there could immediately be some effect even without a program. So I would like to do, I think this is one point of research also. So for the research agenda for improving capacity for research in developing countries, is really for us to look at what kind of implementation research will fit low and middle income countries. We need to look at multiple methodologies, not only RCTs. And we need to look at how other surveys are done, like what they do with marketing and communications, for example. Maybe they would fit. Maybe they're cheaper. I don't know. And we need to develop monitoring and feedback systems at the point of the service providers that are quite easy to do. And we need other kinds of evaluation methods. And one of the interesting ones that I've seen is evaluability assessment, where you even look at a program if it's ready to be evaluated or not. And what do you need to do so that that program will be even at the point where it can be evaluated. Okay, so before I end, I just have some thoughts. I mean, certainly we cannot deal with teenagers and not think about technology. They are, as they say, the natives of technology. We are just the immigrants. And almost all teenagers in the Philippines, rich or poor, has a cell phone. Okay, so what do we do in terms of using that technology to keep these teens connected? I mean, there's so many research where that can be used. And really, technology has shrunk the world. I mean, a lot of you here I met first through Skype. Yeah, Jamie. and we thought you're friends already, actually, just by meeting in Skype and collaborating through Skype. So when we talk about capacity building, technology certainly can play a role there. You may not need to go to Cambridge. There could be long-distance training, okay, through the internet. Okay, so many things can be done with that. And in fact, governments, now have shrunk in the sense that citizens can immediately deal directly with government through technology. Like conditional cash transfers, for example, can be given through ATMs in the bank. So the citizen can deal directly with government. So it's easier, it makes things so much easier in terms of participation.
5 minutes.
Okay, I'm almost done. And then one last thought, really, music. There's so many other interventions that we can do research on, and one of that I feel is music. There are more parts of your brain that is for music than there are for language. And what they have shown in terms of therapy with music and in terms of promoting bonding between parents and family just using music, and even the community, music rituals. The communication comes from a different plane than from your ordinary cognition, and it goes straight to the emotions. So there's so many other interventions out there that we could try if we have the capacity to do research. Okay, so I'll end with these two mantras for evidence-based policy and practice. I love the book of Richard Taylor, Nudge. And his book says, you cannot make evidence-based policy decisions without evidence. And he said, if you want to encourage some activity, make it easy. Okay, thank you.